So good afternoon everyone. Now this is a class with regarding to your Indian Contract Act of 1872, which is basically the statement that is all contracts are agreements, but all agreements are not contracts, which are enshrined in section 10 of Indian Contract Act of 1872. Now before we know all the essential conditions and why all agreements are not considered as contracts, let us know about the terminology of agreement and contract. What is a contract basically? Contract as per section 2 clause H of the Indian Contract Act of 1872, which is all agreements which are enforceable by the court of law. So in this we can divide the contract into two divisions, that is agreements and enforceability. Now what is an agreement? An agreement as per section 2 clause E of the Indian Contract Act of 1872, which states that a set of promises or reciprocal promises which two parties to the contract shall propose to perform. Now what do you consider as enforceability? Enforceability is nothing but which will legally, the performance of the agreement which will legally bind both the parties. Now here we have known the important terms of contracts and agreements. Now let us know all the essential conditions for a valid contract, which is enshrined in section 10 of the Indian Contract Act of 1872, which will make the legal agreements as binding. What is the first one? The first one is basically an offer. Now what is an offer? When one party offers, that is basically proposes to another party either to perform or not to perform, which is abstain from performing that particular aspect. So that is your offer. Now again, offer, it needs to be legally binding on both the parties, which means what? The offer should not be either a counter offer, wherein which the other party will also make an offer instead of acceptance, or it should not be a cross offer where both the parties are making offers based on the same object. So that is your offer for you. And next one, what is an acceptance? When the other party shall give his acceptance, shall consent to either perform, either to do or to abstain from doing something, is considered as your acceptance. As often an acceptance shall not be, that is shall be considered as binding, that means what? It will be bound when there is a consideration. Now what is a consideration? Consideration here is something in return, that is basically it can be either your consideration in monetary form or it can be in your other forms also, that is other than your monetary perspective. And why we are underlining this as lawful, that is basically consideration should be done as per your Indian Contract Act of 1872 only, that is lawful and which will bind both the parties. Now this is your first three aspects or essentials of a valid contract. Now what is the fourth one here? The fourth one here is lawful object. Now what is an object? Basically that object is the purpose for which you form a contract or you enter into an agreement. Now why do you consider it as lawful object here? That is, it should be as per your terms of Indian Contract Act of 1872. Then only you can consider, that is basically it should not be your unlawful or illegal objects. Otherwise it will make the contract as void ab initio or void. It will make the contract as void. Now I forgot to mention this particular statement, wherein which here we would state that why we are considering consideration as most important perspective is, in some aspect it is stated that with no consideration there is no contract. No consideration, no contract. So this thing we need to just consider. And after your lawful object, the fifth and the most important perspective is capacity. That is basically whether the parties to the contract are capable enough to understand the terms and conditions that are prescribed for your contract. That is basically three important considerations for the capacity, that is a person should be a major, and we have to understand that for minor, the contract with a minor is void ab initio. And the next one is basically he should be of sound mind, that is basically contract with a lunatic or contract with a drunkard apart from your lucid intervals is basically not to be considered as a contract at all, that is basically it's a void contract. And the next one is the person should not be disqualified by a court of law. So these are the three important considerations for the capacity. That is basically if the persons are major and of sound mind and are not disqualified by law or only considered as the parties to the agreement. Now after the capacity, the most important perspective that we need to consider is free consent. Now what do you consider as consent? That is basically parties agreeing upon to the same thing at the same sense and at the same time. That is basically this statement is known as consensus ad idem. Consensus ad idem. That is parties agreeing upon to the same thing in the same sense and at the same time. Now, if there is no consensus, that is if the parties' consent is corroded and being obtained in the following 5 categories, it is stated that the consent is not free. That is basically if the consent of the parties is being obtained by coercion. Now what is a coercion? Basically, if you are threatening someone and obtaining consent to the agreement, it is considered as coercion. Threatening is most important from the coercion perspective. What is the second one? It is undue influence. Now what is an undue influence? Basically, that is a parties will be in a fiduciary relationship, that is the case of an example of parent and child, teacher and student, husband and wife. If the one person who is in a dominating position and he is able to influence the other person, it is known as the persons are in fiduciary relationship, and if through that relationship it is misused and if the consent is being obtained with that pressure, it is known as undue influence. This is the second perspective. The third perspective is fraud. You are concealing the truth and you are making the statements. It is known as fraud. And the fourth one is misrepresentation. That is basically you are providing the statements which are basically you have innocently concealed it. You will not know that it is false, but still you have not stated it as true. That is your misrepresentation. And the fifth one is mistake. That is basically it can be of mistake of fact and mistake of law. Mistake of fact can be excusable but not mistake of law, because we have to understand that ignorantia juris non excusat. We cannot state that we do not know anything about the law of the land. And one more important thing that you need to know, that the contract which is being made on the basis of coercion, undue influence, fraud and misrepresentation will make the contract voidable on the option of the other party. What do you consider as voidable? Basically, the other party need not perform his part of the contract and can rescind the contract, whereas mistake renders the contract as void. So this is your free consent perspective. Let's come back to the seventh and the most important point, which is agreements not expressly declared to be void, which means generally what? That is agreements wherein which the object which is being made is not lawful, that is it is illegal or unlawful, or it can be contrary to the law or to the public policy. Those agreements should not be considered as valid. It is expressly declared as void. So those agreements also will not be considered as a valid for the perspective of valid contract. So this is your seventh aspect. And what is your eighth aspect? That is basically possibility of performance. Now you need to understand one important thing here is, for performing a contract there has to be a possibility, that is there has to be a certainty that the contract will be performed. And how it is possible? That is mainly it is based on lawful object, and even your lawful consideration also, and even on the aspects of offer and acceptance also. From the offer state itself, if we feel that you have to make an offer based on your valid and lawful objects, then only we can consider that there is a possibility of performing it. And how people consider the performance of a contract as impossible is basically if the main particular aspect of which we are thinking that it is impossible to perform, that is basically if you are considering, for example, if there is a contract between one person or the other stating that if that particular first party dies and on his death he can marry his daughter, that is considered as impossible to perform because the object or the main basis for your contract is not valid, it is illegal. So that is your possibility of performance. And the ninth one is certainty of meaning, which is basically nothing but based on your consensus ad idem, in which the parties will think about the same object in the same way, in the same sense, and at the same time. So if there is no consensus ad idem, there is no certainty. So for an agreement to be considered, to be entering into the stage of a contract, you need to be seeing that the performance is certain. It should not be corroded by uncertainty. And the last one is legal formalities. Now what do you consider it as legal formalities is basically that the contract, as you already know, the agreements need to be in writing for the parties to be legally bound. So that is your legal formalities, and it covers the first statement, that is all contracts are agreements. Now let us come back to the second statement, that is why all agreements are not contracts. The best examples that I can give you is with relating to domestic and social agreements. Wherein which in the case of your domestic agreements, that is agreements entered into between husband and wife, are not considered as legally binding on both the parties, because even though they might be in the sense that if the husband states that I would like to provide some medical expenditure to the wife based on the oral word, the wife cannot demand it because it is in the form of a domestic agreement and it is not binding upon the husband to provide such medical expenditure, which we will see in the case of Balfour versus Balfour. So here we have to give a conclusion that domestic agreements are not enforceable in the court of law. And let us come back to the social agreements. Social agreements is basically agreement between friends. If one among your friends promises that if he comes to a restaurant or in a business enterprise, wherein which he promises that he would provide you some kind of contract or he would provide you some kind of arrangements for his personal expense, that is he would invite his friends or family to come over and to have some lunch or dinner, and if he would have prepared a specific set of meals for that particular person, and if he does not turn up, then you cannot sue your friend because it is a social agreement, and social agreements are not enforceable in the court of law. And finally, I would like to state that all the 10 essential characteristics of a contract you will all have a discussion further as a separate topics after this class.